there. Welcome to Bible Discoveries, the weekend show. On this program, we discuss big questions that come up as we're reading through the Bible, and we also discuss your questions as well. My name's Corie.
And I'm Matlock.
And if you are not currently reading through the Bible with us, but you would like to be reading through the Bible with us on our reading plan, then check out BibleDiscoveryTV.com. We can get you all hooked up with those studies and the daily show and all that goodness.
That's right. And today we're going over Numbers 4 to Numbers 27, which is pretty exciting.
It is pretty exciting. We're moving steadily through the Torah, through the first 5 books of the Old Testament. If you want a really quick 10-minute recap of those chapters, check out our YouTube channel, which is just my name, because there's always posted there each week a recap of that reading. So let's just jump right in. Our big question today is, why does the Bible highlight so much conflict in the book of Numbers? When we're reading through it, there is a ton of conflict that's going on. So we're also going to be answering viewer questions like, did Moses have 2 wives? Why is God seemingly unjust and unfair in Numbers chapter 5, focusing only on women's sins as opposed to men's sins? We're going to be taking a look at the question of whether or not God is slow to anger, or whether he's really easily angered. And we're also going to be talking about Balaam's donkey as well, because that's a weird one.
Right.
That's a weird one.
So let's open up then. Let's
Sure.
open up. Okay.
Yeah.
Pertaining to Numbers 5, so we were talking about conflict. There's conflict within the text, but it creates conflict in other people sometimes and how they read it.
That's true.
So let me read this viewer question from
Sure.
Laura, okay? So studying in Numbers 5, having a hard time with it.
Yeah.
Is there anything you have for this? Just seems like I'm understanding it wrong. I know God to be fair and just, but that's not what I'm reading in this chapter. Please help.
Okay, Laura. So I'm assuming that you're talking about the test for the unfaithful wife, because that takes up the majority of Numbers chapter 5. It also talks about purity in the camp and making restitution for your wrongs. So whether you're a man or a woman, how you equally have to make restitution for a sin against someone else or against God. But then this test for the unfaithful wife is really interesting, and it does read rather brash and rather shocking to us in the modern West, because we're just not used to this kind of language. But basically what happens is, if a man suspects his wife of adultery, or of being pregnant with another man's child, so adultery, and there's a pregnancy related to that adultery, but he can't prove it, but he's just very angry and very jealous over it, what is he supposed to do as an Israelite man? And so we see him bring the wife to the tabernacle, later it would be the temple, present her to the priest, and give a grain offering on her behalf. And then the priest goes through this ritual with her, in which he mixes water from the tabernacle with dust from the tabernacle floor, writes a curse on a scroll that basically, if she is guilty of adultery, that she would not be able to have children, that she would become a curse, that she would, it's just a bad situation. He rinses the ink off of the scroll into the water, and then she drinks it. And the idea is that if nothing happens to her, then God has pardoned her. He has cleared her name. The jealousy is for naught. She is innocent of the crime. If she's guilty of the crime, a punishment will come on her in her physical body. It looks like she will not be able to bear children. Now, to us, this feels unfair, because it talks about at the end of Numbers chapter 5, how the husband will be innocent of any wrongdoing, but the woman will bear the consequences of her sin. But a couple things that we need to keep in mind here is that in this same Mosaic law, adultery is forbidden and is supposed to be fatal for both parties, for both the man and the woman. So in this case, it's a woman committing adultery against her husband. So it would be the adulterer and the adulteress. If they were caught, if it was known that they actually did this sin, they would be put to death. And we see that in Leviticus 20, verse 10, and also Deuteronomy 22, verse 22. This was a capital offense. However, this is when a wife is suspected of adultery, but it's not for sure. So I think it would be most helpful to see Numbers chapter 5 as God limiting what normally would have happened in this culture, which is the man, as the legal and social authority, just had the right, or it was socially acceptable for him to put away the woman for any reason. So if he suspected her of adultery, he could divorce her. He could set her out, back to her father's house, if there even was such a thing, make her destitute, essentially, without an authority, without a legal representative in that world at that time. Well, in this situation, God is saying, no, absolutely not. If you're jealous, bring her to me. Bring her to the tabernacle, bring her to the temple, and allow me to judge. Now, unless you believe in magic, this is not going to have an effect. It's not as if the priest is poisoning the wife. He's got ink, water, and dust, and he's mixing it together and she's drinking it. This would effectively do nothing to her physically, okay? This is not a magic potion. But what it is symbolic of God's judgment. So it's invoking God's name, and asking for him to judge whether she's innocent or whether she's guilty. So we should not see this as the priest poisoning the woman. We shouldn't even see this as God being an unfair God. What we should see this is as God limiting what would have been normal behavior. So a husband is not allowed to divorce his wife for any reason, even if he suspects her of adultery. If he can't prove it, he asks God to judge. Now, of course, in this as well, the man that she slept with, if she was guilty, is not mentioned here in Numbers chapter 5, but the understanding of the ancient Israelite would have been that man would not have gotten off the hook, that God would also judge him. I mean, when you look at how God spoke through Moses to the tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, later on, it's in Numbers 32. Numbers 32, verse 23, they agreed to a certain set of rules in their interaction with the other tribes. And God says, make sure that you do this, because be sure your sin will find you out if not. God is judge even over the secret sin. I mean, when you go into Psalm 20, which was a song that the ancient Israelites sung and knew about God, it says, the psalmist says to God, you have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. So we shouldn't see just the adulterous wife bearing the burden at this point. It also God's judgment would have also been invoked on the adulterer if indeed this felt guilty. So to answer your question, I hope this helps in parsing this out for you. I believe that this should be seen as God limiting divorce, where the man cannot just divorce his wife if he suspects adultery, but instead he needs to bring her before God, and he must accept the results of this. So if nothing happens to this woman, if she's not cursed, she is innocent of all crimes.
That's a great answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much spot on. I have nothing really to add, so it's pretty much spot on. But in light of this whole having multiple wives or committing adultery and stuff like that, what about this question? Okay, so it pertains to Numbers 12.
Okay. I know where this is going.
Okay, yeah. So did Moses have 2 wives? And the comparison is to Exodus 4, verse 20.
Okay.
So did Moses have 2 wives? Because we know that in Exodus 4, he marries Zipporah.
Yes.
Right. And then Numbers 12.
So in Numbers 12, Miriam and Aaron, so Moses' older siblings.
Yeah.
So Miriam is a type of prophet to Israel. She's called the prophet, right? Because she's involved in the musical worship of God in Israel. And Aaron is the high priest. And Moses is the prophet and leader of Israel. So we've got these 3 siblings who are in key roles of leadership in Israel. But there's a rift, right? It says in verse 1 of chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. This is confusing to anyone who's read the story, because we know that his wife Zipporah was a Midianite,
right,
not a Cushite. And there's a few different ways that people resolve this, because the Bible doesn't give us this is literally it. This is the detail that gives us, for he had married a Cushite. We know that later in Micah, I believe it's Micah, Micah's talking about Midian, and he refers to Midian as Cushan or Cushan. So it's possible that there's a connection between Midian and Cushan, but not Cush. This is specifically Cushite. And at this time, so some people say, well, the Bible here is talking about Midian, it's talking about Zipporah, which, okay, it's possible that Zipporah was becoming a problem, because we know that according to Exodus, Zipporah came back to Egypt with Moses, but at some point, Moses sent Zipporah away. Whether in divorce or whether for safety, we're not sure. That phrase "sent away" is usually used of divorce when it's used in the Bible. But then once Israel is at Mount Sinai, we see Jethro bringing back Zipporah and Gershom and Moses' other son. And Moses accepts them back. So was Zipporah sent away because she was creating a problem with the Israelites, because she was not an Israelite, because she was a Midianite and the daughter of a priest? And then later Moses reconciled, and then it became a problem with Miriam and Aaron? Maybe. We don't know. This is hypothetical, right? Another possible solution is that Zipporah died and Moses married a Cushite. We know from Exodus as well that it was not just the native biological Hebrews that left Egypt in the Exodus. Mm-hmm. There were other people, oppressed people in Egypt, who chose to leave Egypt with Moses and the Israelites. And we know at this time, so according to internal biblical studies, the Exodus would have happened around 1446 BC. And at that time in Egyptian history outside of the Bible, we know that there was a large Cushite from Cush population in Egypt proper. Now, Cush was an African nation around the area of Ethiopia. So there was a huge presence of that in Egypt at the time. So there could have been actual Cushites from Cush living in the wilderness with Moses. So did Zipporah die? And Moses remarried a Cushite? And were Miriam and Aaron annoyed because he couldn't just choose from one of the daughters of Israel? Why did he have to choose from a Cushite? Which, of course, at that point would have been as good as a native Israelite, because would have been under the covenant with God, right? The foreigners among you is how God responds to them, how he is God of them anyway. Another theory, there's one more theory, is that Moses had a Cushite Egyptian wife before he fled to Midian, and that he married Zipporah under the pretense that he was never going back to Egypt.
Right.
But then when he went back to Egypt, they reconciled. So there's these three issues. I tend to lean towards Zipporah died and he married a Cushite, because it all of a sudden becomes a problem in Numbers 12. But just because I lean towards that doesn't mean that that's how it actually was.
Well, yeah. And then to add to that, because you're also making the case that God's restricting this ease of divorce, basically. Mm-hmm. So it would be weird for him just to easily dismiss Zipporah and divorce her. It's so easy for Moses, but no one else is subject to it. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So I think that your gut feeling is actually more spot on, I would say.
I think it makes the most sense of Cush. I think that it is a bit of a stretch to associate the Midianites with the word Cushite, because Cushan and Cushite is not the same word. It both has Cush in it. I get that. I get that. So it's possible, but I don't think it's the best natural explanation of the text. But regardless, Miriam and Aaron thought it was a problem, but God did not think it was a problem that Moses had married a Cushite specifically. So whether this was an internal race issue, unclear. If it was, God was fine with Moses marrying a Cushite who had become a part of Israel. And we see this across the board with Israel's history when they marry outside of Israel and that person attaches themselves to Israel. For example, in the case of Rahab, in the case of Ruth, this is totally fine. Totally fine. So But yeah, interesting. We do know also that it does appear like Miriam and Aaron had some pent-up aggression with Moses when you read this, and that the Cushite wife was kind of like the straw that bent the camel's back because really they're angry about Moses' authority. Verse 2 says, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us?
Right.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, but that's a pretty brutal thing to say when you know that God has made him the leader.
Right.
Anyway, I digress. I hope that helps answer your question. 3 main options that people put forward.
That's good.
Okay, so Matt, look, I have a question for you.
All right.
So, in Numbers chapter 14, God is portrayed, he's spoken of as slow to anger.
Okay.
But then in Psalm 2, verse 12, it talks about God being quick. His wrath coming quickly and God being quickly to anger.
Okay.
So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction here. Is God properly understood as slow to anger, or should we see him as more reactionary? He's quick to anger.
Right.
And why would the Bible say both about him? Like, why would it create this tension in his personality? Which is it, slow to anger or fast to anger?
Okay, well, just quickly, as a person, that's contextual. Like, it depends. Like, if God's not a system. So in other words, it's not like he's always quick to anger and he's always slow to anger. Mm-hmm. It's like sometimes it just depends on what's going on. I guess someone sinning egregiously, then it's like, yeah, maybe he's quick to anger at that person who knows better. Mm-hmm. But is he slow to anger with people who don't know better? Well, yes, sure. So let me read you this quote. This is from 2 Peter 3.
Sure.
So it says, the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. Ugh. Anyways, sorry about messing up there.
That's okay.
But the point here is that God is slow to anger and he's patient so that people will self-realize and repent. So he's putting the onus on the people to turn from their evil ways and repent.
Right.
That's the reason why he waited 400 years to judge the Amorites. Now,
right. So you're talking about when God promises Abraham in Genesis that his descendants will inherit the land of Canaan, but not yet, because the sin of the Amorites and the Hittites and those people groups who lived in Canaan, it wasn't complete, and so he wasn't going to judge them yet.
That's right. So regardless of quick or slow, that just depends. But I think that I know this is a part of the viewer question from Aowen is that what does this have to do with God's wrath too? So in other words, he's angry and he has wrath, and is there a difference there? It's like, well, God's wrath is part of that judgment process. Mm-hmm. And God's anger, like God could be angry at Moses for not circumcising his kids.
Yeah, which happened.
But he's not, Moses is not subject to God's wrath. So there's a fundamental difference between anger and wrath.
Right.
And that's important because wrath is part of the final not even necessarily, I shouldn't say final judgment because everyone thinks of the apocalypse, but I mean, wrath is part of judgment, and anger is basically an emotional response.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Right. So, and like I said before, there's slow to anger and there's quick to anger. It just depends on the context of who you are and what you know, and it depends what you can do, what you can't do. So it is circumstantial in that sense. Yeah. And God can be angry. But again, it is fundamentally different to say that someone who's angry is subject to their wrath. Like if God's angry at me, I'm not necessarily subject to his wrath.
Right.
Right? Like that is for the judgment of sinners. And sometimes Israel is subject to his wrath, as you see later on in the text.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that would be off the cuff my quick answer to that.
Sure. And I think to add to what you're saying, I mean, the context of Numbers 14, where Moses quotes back to God, you said that you're slow to anger, because this is Israel is sinning against God in a pretty brutal way in Numbers chapter 14, and Moses is reminding God, like, please treat them with your mercy, because I know it's part of your character that you are slow to anger. And he is quoting from Exodus chapter 34, when God reveals his glory to Moses, and God says of himself, this is Exodus 34 verse 6, and he, God, passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Now, there's a lot to unpack in there, but I want to stick with the anger. So God, when he's revealing himself to Moses, does claim as part of his character this slow to anger. Another way of saying that would literally be patient.
Right.
God is patient in his
That's right.
judgment, right? Which is what you were talking about,
Right.
especially in reference, a really great example is that Abraham into Canaan. You can't go yet because
Right.
their sin isn't worth that
That's
judgment
right.
yet. It doesn't match that judgment yet. But then she mentioned Psalm 2, because in Psalm 2, there is this quickness of wrath that is mentioned. So the context of Psalm 2 is talking about nations conspiring against God and against the King of Israel and the Messiah, essentially, that God has set up against the Lord's anointed. And it goes through this whole psalm. And at the very end, in verses 10 to 12, it says this: "Therefore, you kings," talking to all the pagan kings, "be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him."
Right.
So this actually goes really well with the judgment of God for someone who is in that situation, who is facing the judgment of God. The Canaanites living in Canaan, it would have felt like God's judgment came fast and hard. Right? Sodom and Gomorrah, fast and hard. But in reality, it had been a long, slow fade, a long, slow build-up to the judgment of God.
That's right.
And I mean, we even see that now with Christ. I mean, God's plan of salvation is now in effect. Jesus Christ has come. He died. He rose again. But there's this long period of time before he's coming back, because when he comes back, humanity will be judged. And so there's this slow burn.
Right. And looking at it like a bomb with a big wick.
Yeah.
I think is helpful.
Yeah, like their judgment will come. God's wrath will come, but he's patient.
That's right. So you're seeing the flame going, and then when everyone repents, someone grabs the end of that wick. God grabs the end of the wick and puts it out.
Of theirs, yeah.
Of theirs, so
I
the
see
bomb
what you're
doesn't
saying.
go off. So you have this idea that repentance pretty much stops God's wrath. And you see that in Jonah when they repent, right?
Right,
the book of Jonah.
God is willing to accept the repentance even of a pagan nation.
Right, and Nineveh and Assyria was terrible. Like by all standards, like you think the Nazis are bad, they had technology to be as evil as they were. You don't have technology. Like Assyria was as evil as a culture as they come.
Yes.
So very much comparable and in a different sense. But I think what's important there is that once again you have this slow to anger perpetually, and then once you're like going against God, then your destruction.
It reaches
swift.
a certain point.
That's right.
Where when your judgment comes, your judgment it's there.
That's right.
It's done. It's quick. It's efficient.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the nail on the head right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the difference
so
between
too.
anger and wrath. Yeah.
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 Awesome. I
All
hope
right.
that helps.
Yeah, I got a question for you.
Sure.
Okay, so, and this is a Bible question, but it's kind of like there's not much information about this in the Bible. So your expertise in archaeology and history will be helpful here.
Okay.
So why did Balaam's donkey talk? Did it really talk? And why was Balaam unfazed by this?
Okay, fair enough. Did it really talk? It's fair enough.
Yeah.
I laugh because our culture is so different than the ancient culture. I don't think that the donkey talking would have been as much of a problem to ancient Israel, to whom this was written, as it is to us. We're like, oh, donkeys don't talk. How could it? Did it really talk? It just makes me laugh because I don't think that would have been an issue for ancient Israel. Mainly because there are whispers, there are hints of the concept of very spiritual people in the ancient Near Eastern culture claiming to be able to receive messages from the gods through animals. So it probably was a cultural context thing, where this was something that perhaps a diviner / prophet like Balaam was this wouldn't have shocked him because different animals represented the gods, and you could open the mouth of an idol and expect to receive messages from the gods that way. Various omens and things like that.
We get very particular because if the donkey doesn't have vocal cords, well, did God generate vocal cords?
Right.
And so we're very particular. Science.
I see. Was this a physical question?
Yes.
Did the donkey maybe, guys, I don't know. I don't know. Was it a different voice?
It goes against science, so yeah.
Did God allow the soul of the donkey to speak? I don't know, but this did not shock Balaam because he probably expected messages from the gods in this fashion. And what was the other part of the question?
Well, the other part.
Why did he?
Why was he unfazed, and why did Balaam's donkey talk?
Okay, so the unfazed we've kind of talked about. There was a cultural context to that where you could receive messages from the gods in strange ways and even through nature. So I think it makes sense why he wasn't phased.
And
he may have been somewhat phased. It just doesn't record
Isn't there actual archaeological evidence of this culture speaking with the animals, from what I recall?
Yes. I just can't remember off the top of my head what the evidence is, but I'm pretty sure it's literary, and it's pretty ancient, and it's about spiritual people being able to communicate with animals.
Right. It's really interesting. Right.
I will have to look that up and put it on our YouTube in the comments if I can find it.
That's fun.
Okay, but culturally, there does appear to be a context where that was okay. But now, why? That's the more important part. Why did the donkey die? Was that part of it?
Yeah. Why would God use Balaam's donkey?
Okay, this is so interesting. And on the Daily Show, I did a couple segments on Balaam and the donkey. There seems to be this beautiful narrative thing going on where the author of Numbers is pointing out to us how God is using the donkey to symbolically represent Israel. And what I mean by that is Balaam, the donkey is responding to the angel of the Lord, just as Israel is responding to God. The donkey sees the angel of the Lord and is like, man, we're going to die because the angel of the Lord has a sword and he's blocking our path. He's ready to confront us. So I'm going to get off this path. I don't want to die. Just as Israel is literally following the manifestation of God in the wilderness, in the cloud by day, in the fire by night. They're just going where God has them to go. And yes, they're camping in Midian right now, and the Midianites don't like it, but they're there not to hurt Midian. They're there because that's where God told them to go. Same with the donkey. It's just avoiding death by following God's direction, okay? And Balaam beats the donkey because it's following God. Just as Balaam and Balak want to curse Israel just because they're following God. And Balaam beats the donkey 3 times. He tries to curse Israel 3 times. And then the donkey says to Balaam, like, why are you hitting me? I've done nothing to you. Everything in my past, I've never done this in the past. Why aren't you questioning why I'm here? Well, just like Balaam should have questioned why Israel was there. So this is really interesting narrative going back and forth, right? So we've got that layer where symbolically it's mirroring what's going on. And what this shows us is that God seems to be giving Balaam an opportunity for a real character change here, a character changing moment. Get the hint, Balaam, and don't curse Israel. But unfortunately, this character changing moment doesn't happen for Balaam. He still goes and finds another way to curse Israel. We're told in Numbers 31 that he teaches, he tells Balak, get the Israelites to break their covenant with God, and then they will, that's a curse unto themselves. So he figures it out that way. So it really does appear to be God giving Balaam this opportunity for a character-changing moment, using this donkey, making it weird enough that Balaam pays attention to it.
Right.
That, he was a smart guy. He was a diviner and a prophet. It was literally his job to interpret omens and signs from the spiritual world. So he, more than anyone, should have been able to figure out what was going on here. Why is God making my donkey talk? Why is the angel of the Lord standing in my path? He should have been asking these questions and then changing his character. He had this opportunity for change because of it, and he chose not to. So this is a failure of a character-changing moment. And I think it's really interesting to pair this up against other narratives that in which God has done a very similar or the same thing. So consider for a moment with me that God did a very, very similar thing to Jacob, the patriarch Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
So God tells Jacob to leave Laban, leave Padan Aram, and go back to the land of Canaan. But on the eve of his entrance into Canaan, the angel of the Lord shows up and physically wrestles, physically tries to injure Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why? We've talked about this on this show before. It was a character-changing moment for Jacob where he receives a new name and he is supposed to fundamentally change. Instead of him fighting for everything that he has, instead of him fighting for himself and for his own name and for his inheritance, now it's God is going to fight for Jacob because Jacob is moving into being the proprietor of the Abrahamic covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Moses, God tells Moses, go back to Egypt. You're going to talk to Pharaoh, and through you, I'm going to rescue my people. Go to Egypt. So Moses goes to Egypt. And on the way, God tries to kill him. Now, there's a lot going on in that whole situation, but what ends up happening is a status change. Regardless of why you think he did it, a status change happens, right? Moses' son gets circumcised and is now qualified into the Abrahamic covenant. So there's a status change. So every time this seems to happen, there seems to be this opportunity for change. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So I think the fact that God said, go with the men, and Balaam goes with the men, and then all of a sudden the angel of the Lord's trying to kill Balaam.
Right.
We've got a similar process here. And then when you pair that up with the literary connection between Israel and the donkey, we see an opportunity for character change for Balaam. Now, tragically, he does not change his character, and he ends up dying by an Israelite sword, which is ironic because he tells the donkey, who symbolically seems to represent Israel in a way, he says to the donkey, if I had my sword, I would kill you.
Mm-hmm.
And then he ends up dying by an Israelite sword.
Right.
Interesting stuff.
Very good.
So that would be my kind of like short answer, believe it or not. I know that was long, but that would be my short answer to why I think the donkey spoke. Because it also does tie into Balaam ends up becoming like the donkey because the donkey kind of just speaks to Balaam as like an unfeeling, unthinking animal. He speaks to God. The intimation is that God puts words in the donkey's mouth.
Same thing with Balaam. He tries to curse Israel 3 times, can't do it, blesses them. But then the 4th time, the Spirit of God comes on Balaam. He comes on Balaam, and Balaam just prophesies about the future of Israel. Right.
So he becomes a mouthpiece, just as his animal became a mouthpiece. So by not changing, Balaam then becomes like an unthinking beast before God.
Right.
A mouthpiece.
Which is ironic.
Lots of stuff
going on. Well, there's a lot of things to think about.
Lots of stuff going on.
Because especially like we were saying, I wish you had the archaeological evidence with you. If that was something that was pertinent to their culture, that being able to speak to animals identifies you as, say, a prophet, a seer, or some sort of spiritual person, a diviner. Mm-hmm. God is speaking to Balaam in the way that he understands.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah. So God is, once again, you see this throughout the text, not just to Israel, but also to other nations too, to other people.
Absolutely.
God is constantly speaking in a way that they will understand in the best way. You know who you're speaking to.
Okay, this brings up a whole other thing because people get really freaked out by the fact that God spoke to Balaam in the way that he did because he's a pagan diviner.
Right.
And yet God's speaking to him and God's allowing this divination to work.
Right.
This happens again in the Witch of Endor.
Right.
Okay, so Saul goes to the witch. He goes to the necromancer.
Yes.
And it seems as if she successfully brings Samuel from the dead.
Yes.
So God allows this divination to work. It doesn't mean that it always works, but when he chooses, at the very least, when God chooses these methods, he allows these methods to work for a reason, which makes a lot of people really uncomfortable. But I think, like you're saying, it points to his grace.
Right.
It points to his mercy. He is willing to use flawed communication to speak with people because he wants us to change. He wants to communicate with us, right? He made us so that we could communicate to
That's
him.
right.
And we lost that ability largely. So I find this so interesting and revelatory when it comes to the character and the nature of God.
Yeah. Well, especially in, people often look at the Old Covenant, skeptics or people who are attacking the faith or are doubting the faith or whatever it might be. Look at the Old Covenant, especially the law, as like strictly pro-Israel, as like somehow Christian nationalism. And it's like you see stuff like this, it's like, no, like you have to actually read what. First of all, if you read it, you'd find out for a second that it's not pro-Israel.
No,
because
it's
constantly
pro-God, anti-human in a way.
Yeah.
Like it's pro-human too, because it's God's plan of redemption for
Yeah,
humans,
right.
but it's certainly not portraying humanity nor Israel
Yeah,
in this like rose-colored glasses,
That's right.
positive, you're awesome
right.
sort of
But
way.
it just shows you how much bigger it is than just Israel.
Oh yeah.
Right.
It's God's plan of salvation for mankind.
That's right.
For mankind through Israel.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very
Jesus
cool.
was the inheritor and the fulfiller of the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah.
So cool.
Very cool.
So cool. Okay, so I think that's all of our viewer questions and Bible questions, correct?
Yeah, I say so.
Okay, so big question now. Big picture time. Reading through Numbers, there's tons of conflict.
Yeah.
We've talked about some of them. So why does the Bible highlight so much conflict in Numbers? So we've got like just a few examples. We've got the people complaining against God in Numbers 11.
Yeah.
And then again in Numbers 14. We have conflict between the highest leadership in Israel, right? Miriam, Abraham, and Moses in Numbers chapter 12. We have the people then coming into conflict against the leadership of Israel, specifically Aaron in Numbers 16 and 17. Do you remember when like the rest of the Levites are like, oh, Aaron, we're Levites too, we're holy too. And then God has them put their staffs overnight in the tabernacle and Aaron's staff buds. Then there's also, of course, the conflict that's outside of Israel between God and Balaam.
Right.
So why so much conflict?
Well, okay, so there's already like
the sigh.
there's
I liked the sigh.
Sorry.
It was good.
There's I think you already mentioned there Korah's rebellion, right? Putting the staffs in there.
The light just went out. That might be distracting people. I saw it too.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
Korah's rebellion. With they put the staffs down and then Aaron's buds. Well, that's like they're threatening hierarchical positioning. So not threatening God himself. In a sense they are. But they're like, no, Aaron, like we're equally as holy as you. They're kind of missing the point here, right? Because they're putting themselves right. But at the same time, so it's like, okay, in one sense, this conflict is diminishing the hierarchy that God has established, right? God, Moses, Aaron, and it kind of goes down the list. So in one sense, it's kind of like, I'm going to go against what God has established. That's one thing. And you're seeing the ill effects of what happens when people do that.
Right.
And that's so it's like, it's good to teach people what to do, but also what not to do. And it really helps to learn from the negative as opposed to always the positive. The law is like, do all these things, but it's like, well, here's what happens when you don't do these things. So,
and you said something really, really good. You were like, they're missing the point.
Yes.
When they come up against God, they're missing the point in these conflicts. And I think that's very true. I think in some of the cases, they're missing the point completely, like obliviously.
Yes.
But I think in other cases, they're purposefully missing the point for their own benefit.
Yes.
Like in the case of Balaam, he would have known what's going on, but And Miriam and Aaron, they know that Moses his face glows. They know.
Yeah, right.
But they want more, for whatever reason, they want more power and authority or leadership. And so they're going against it. And same with Korah going against
That's right.
Aaron.
Yeah, and so much of the conflict kind of boils down to this unwilling to submit, push for powers. And you see this in Christ, right? When the brothers of thunder, they're like, hey, can I sit at your right hand?
Oh,
and,
right.
Yeah, and he's like, no, it just doesn't work that way, pals.
Sorry, guys. Not the way it works.
Yeah, that's right. But people always striving and pushing for power, and they're diminishing the hierarchy that God has established. And that's one essence of the conflict of, like you were saying, and we were both saying, about missing the point. Because there's a purpose for why God has established that in the first place. And I think that, one, it helps to be obedient and submissive when there is that. It creates a holy culture, right, as we talked about many times. But it also shows how God works.
Absolutely.
Right. And that not necessarily in his character, it is that, but also in how he responds. And that's really important as well. So through the hierarchy that God establishes, he's revealing his character and how he responds to these situations that kind of come up. And I think that is maybe more on the point for like why there are so many conflicts in Numbers.
I think so too. I think it's really highlighting because we've got a bunch of the laws. We know how Israel was supposed to live, but what happens practically when Israel resists God and when individuals resist each other and when there is this conflict? Conflicts can be a really amazing learning opportunities because it shows you a lot about yourself and a lot about the person that you're conflicting against or confronting or coming against. So we see humanity's response and individual responses, because they are different based like personality-wise, to God and his leadership. But then your point is well taken. We also see then how God responds to these situations, which I think is really interesting because God comes in with judgment. There are consequences for rebelling against him. But he also comes in with forgiveness when forgiveness is genuinely sought. So he forgave Miriam rather than killing her, rather than giving her, because she apparently was spearheading the rebellion against God and Aaron was just backing her up. So she received a harsher punishment. Rather than God putting her to death essentially for rebelling against him, he gives her a timed consequence. And Moses prays for her, and this forgiveness is sought, and the forgiveness is granted, is really... Yeah, go ahead.
No, and he does so in a way that is culturally pertinent. So, for example, if your father spits in your face, will you not be ashamed?
Would you not be unclean for 7 days?
That's right. So, in a way, it's like he's speaking to them on their level.
I'm your father.
That's right.
And that was wrong.
That's exactly right. So so he's doing it in a way that they will understand, but also too, it's like appropriate for their culture.
Yes.
So it's not like he's not doing this like out of the blue, like, hey, here's a brand new punishment just for you alone.
Right.
He's doing it in a very fatherly, familial way.
Yeah, and I mean, our kids, when you have kids, you speak to them on their level because you love them, and you're not punishing them just to get the kicks. You're like, oh, I'm on a power trip, and I'm punishing you because I can. Or a
desired result. You don't want them just to have act exactly the way you want them to act.
Yeah, you're trying to train them literally into righteousness and not into folly, not into their own sin, right? So speaking in a way that they have the best chance of understanding what you have. And you're right. We do see that with Miriam, and we do see that in Numbers.
And I think that factors into this whole idea of it being conflict, because you're challenging, like in the Core's rebellion again, you're challenging the hierarchy, what God has established.
Yes.
So with that, God has to respond in an appropriate way, because you're not just in this, especially in Core's rebellion, you're challenging holiness.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, we're inherently holy. As opposed to, right? It's like you've missed the point. And God made that very clear.
Yeah.
That I am holy and I make you holy. And he writes that throughout all Leviticus, all Numbers. He's just saying that I make you holy. And they somehow get in their head that they're holy in and of themselves.
They're not satisfied with the role that God has given them.
Right. And as you said again, as you pointed out, that they're either oblivious or willfully ignorant towards this. And that what's ironic about that is that is basically what hypocrisy is. Yeah. Right? And when you look at how God judges throughout the whole Bible, I don't need to rant about this for too long, but God is judging those who are essentially hypocrites, literal and oblivious. Sometimes people are completely oblivious to their own hypocrisy, right? And you see that in the New Testament always. Christ came down, and even though God made these people, they did not receive Christ. You have that irony there, right? But they're completely oblivious, or they don't want to be, in a sense, right? So you have in this whole thing almost like a deep-seated unwillingness to want to change, and that's where the rise of conflict comes out. Because if you're hardened in heart, you can't be molded like you can clay or anything. True. And I think that's kind of what this boils down to. So you're kind of seeing the human condition on the forefront against what God's set up. And who's going to win in this conflict? Is it going to be human right? And not necessarily who's going to win is really what it's showing, because everyone knows intuitively God's going to win.
Right.
Hence the book. But what it's showing is that the human will to constantly push for its own power, and how God deals with that.
How God responds, and thus displaying his character.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's one big answer for
It's a big question.
Yeah.
It's a big answer. It may not be the perfect answer,
No,
but it is.
There's more to that, because it's a
I know there's so much more, but that's the nature of going through the Bible quickly too. Is like it does give you this ability to look at things on a broader scale, because you can kind of see, oh wow, we've gone through Numbers. There's a lot of conflict in here.
Right.
You can see overarching themes, I think, but yeah, it is quick. Anyway, that's it for today. If you have any comments or questions, pop them down in the comments below. Also, if you have questions for books that are coming up, like when we're getting into Kings and Samuel and Proverbs and Psalms and some of the prophets, if you can think of them, please send them to us. Comment down below, because we'd love to have a chance to discuss your questions. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching. We want to keep producing high-quality biblical content, but we can't do it without your support. If you feel called to support us, please click the link in the description under Donate. Your support really means a lot to us.